take up an extremely influential argument that leads to an atheistic or a non-theistic position, that there is, in fact, no God. It's based on a particular problem that has plagued believers in the gods or God for as long as there have been believers in the gods. And the purpose of the argument is to show that the existence of a God, but especially such a one as proposed by Christians, Jews, and Muslims, contradicts one undeniable fact about the world. And that fact is that evil exists. So the argument's purpose is to show that the existence of God and the existence of evil are incompatible. And this has traditionally been called the argument from evil. It's also called the theodicy problem. How do we justify God given the nature of the world that we find ourselves in? And what's especially poignant about this argument is that many religions, of course, take morality, good, bad, right, wrong, very seriously. So this argument is especially charged in claiming to show that morality, in fact, is incompatible with God. Now, it's a natural theology argument because it takes as bedrock or as foundational, we're going to proceed by observable facts and reasoning, and that our belief in God cannot be logically contradictory to observable facts. But there is one undeniable evaluative fact about the world, that is, bad things happen. And as a subset of bad things happen, outright evil exists in the world. Now, all religions have ethics as part of their appeal. They will posit different kinds of gods in varying degrees of power and majesty. But let me just give you two Greek examples as well, one from a poet and one from a historian. First, from Anacreon, referring to the god Ares, the god of war. And after a war, he's noticing a certain individual, a heroic fighter who had died in battle, and he reflects. Here lies Timocritus, soldier, valiant in battle. Ares spares not the brave man, but the coward, unquote. So, if we are to believe in the gods and the gods' goodness, how is it that it is the brave and the valiant who died in war rather than the cowardly who ran away? Another from the great historian Thucydides, also reflecting on who dies and who lives. As for the gods, it seemed to be the same thing, whether one worshipped them or not, when one saw the good and the bad dying indiscriminately, unquote. So if the purpose of religion is to instill a moral code, and that people who are good are to be favored by the gods and those who are bad disfavored, how is it that it doesn't seem to matter whether you're religious or not, you're going to die by the same causes and so forth? Now, the Greeks had polytheistic gods. They're powerful and knowledgeable. And, of course, there's the fallback, which is to say, why don't they do more for the cause of goodness? Well, perhaps they don't know, perhaps they can't do things about it, but of course, one possibility is that perhaps the Greek gods and goddesses don't even exist, and that's why they don't intervene. But this is especially a problem for those religions that posit an infinite, right, or a perfect God, because then we can't fall back and say, well, that God didn't know, or he couldn't do anything about it, or he was indifferent to the sufferings and evil doings of human beings. So I go to some contemporary examples. Passing through Indiana some years ago, read in the newspaper a case of a little girl who'd been shopping with her mother. I think it was in a pharmacy, or maybe the pharmacy section of a grocery store. And anyways, the little girl, 3 or 4 years old, doing what kids do, picking stuff up off the shelves and looking at it and saying, hey, Mommy, can we get this? And so on. So she had apparently picked up a cardboard carton of toothpaste and was holding it, and it exploded. And it turned out it was a bomb. Some guys, sick bastards, had decided they would make a little pipe bomb, insert it in a carton of toothpaste tube, and then take it back into the pharmacy, place it on the shelf, knowing that sooner or later someone was going to pick this thing up and have a motion detonator that would cause it to explode. So it just happened to be this little girl who ended up apparently being paralyzed in one hand and blind in one of her eyes. And I was reading the newspaper account, and there's the mother of this little girl being interviewed, obviously anguished by what had happened, but she puts the theodicy problem very poignantly. She asks, quote, "Why did God let this happen to my little angel?" Unquote. And so clearly a believer, totally perplexed and not understanding how a good, powerful, all-knowing God would let something so terrible happen. Now, not to be too callous, that's one little girl. There are also, of course, the cases of serial killers. There's plenty of those who repeatedly capture and do terrible things and then kill people, often young women, over and over again, and they get away with it. Some of them, of course, we eventually catch, but some we don't. And that might amount to a few dozens of people, and then we scale up to genocides like the Holocaust, and then we start talking in mind-staggeringly numbers of millions and millions of people and so forth. Now, maybe this is just me, but this seems to be in the dark humor category. We can talk about other kinds of evils, or at least terrible bad things. I was reading recently a report of a British man on vacation in Africa, and he's going swimming in Lake Malawi, and apparently while he was there, there's a parasitic worm that is quite tiny that crawled inside his swim trunks and crawled up his penis inside his body, where it laid its eggs. And as a result of this, the man contracted bilharzia, which is a terribly nasty disease that can be fatal. And then we started to say, well, okay, this is a pretty nasty little creature. Who created the parasitic worm and gave it this life cycle? And why would, presumably the God creator of the universe allow creatures like this to exist? All right, but let's now turn to making the argument more systematic and formalizing it. That's initially some anecdotal ways of introducing the argument, but what's of interest in this argument, particularly in the Abrahamic religions, is their conception of an infinitely perfect God, and this is the God we're to believe in and worship. So there are three immediate features of perfection that are typically posited. God is said to be omnipotent, or all-powerful, omniscient, or all-knowing, and omnibenevolent, or all-good. That then is to say that God is perfect in all of these dimensions, and they are three expressions of his infinity. Now, while here on earth things are, in the natural world more broadly, things are limited and finite and imperfect, God in the supernatural world, the world that is above and beyond nature, is unlimited and without finitude. So that means there's no limits you can ascribe to God. You can't say there are things he can't do, or you can't say that there are things that he doesn't know about, or that God has bad days and good days. No, he is literally infinite in all dimensions. So he's like the number series. You can't reach the end of it by counting. Now, God is also on the standard model in the Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, said to be the creator of the universe. And so one, of course, reason why people come to believe in God is they feel a need to give an answer to the question, why does reality exist? Why does the universe exist? Who created the universe? And so they are led to posit the existence of a God who is an all-powerful creator of the universe. So now we then have four features in the standard model: omnipotence, omniscience, omnibenevolence, and being the creator of the universe. So then we take that conception of God and we look at the world, or the reality that this God is alleged to have created. And the fact is that evil exists in this world, bad things that happen on a regular basis. Small scale things. We catch colds, right? We get bitten by mosquitoes. People lie about us and tell insults. We get bitten by dogs, and tornadoes occur, and hurricanes, and so forth. And on a broader scale, there are just downright evil things that happen. There are genocides. There are people who delight in torturing other people, tearing their minds and bodies apart, and they practice that and they get away with it. There are disgustingly gory murders of innocent people that take place all the time. Children get raped, sometimes by their own fathers, and the list goes on and on and on again. So here's the question, if this God who created the world is supposed to be all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good, why did he create a world in which so much evil exists? And not only that, why would he create a world not only with so much evil, why would he create a world with any evil in it at all? Surely if he really is all-powerful, he could have created any world he wanted, including a completely perfect world where nothing goes wrong, everybody is happy, no evils occur. And surely, if God really is all good, that's the kind of world he would have created, a beautiful and perfect world. So we think of God the Father, right, for example, metaphorically perhaps, but think then of being a good parent, right? You are a parent and you bring a child into the world. Well, what do you want it to do? Well, to the extent you have the knowledge, you create the most beautiful home and nursery you can, and you try to protect your child from all of the evils that you are aware of. To the extent that you have the power, you use all of your power to do so, and to the extent that you're a good parent, you want to do this. So, if God then has all knowledge, all power, and all goodness, then like an exalted parent, there really shouldn't be any evil in the world. So, in short form, if we suppose that God is a creator of the universe and he's an all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good creator, then he could create any kind of universe that he wanted. If he's all-knowing, then he's aware of everything past, present, and future. If he's all-good, he would want to create a perfect universe. So, if there really is God, the universe would be perfect. But the universe is not perfect, and so by modus tollens, denying the consequent standard logical move, we conclude that supposed God does not exist. Now, the validity of the argument is typically not questioned. The soundness of the argument is where the debate occurs, whether all of the premises follow. And so what those who want to defend the standard conception of God need to do at this point, and they typically will do by coming up with 4 or 5 responses to the argument to try to show that there are ways you can make a perfect God compatible with a less than perfect world that he created. Now, the first response, and probably the most popular one that is made, is called the free will response. And the argument here is to say that God did in fact create a perfect world, but he created it with human beings in it. And he gave human beings free will, the choice to do good things or bad things. And some human beings, many of them or all of them, depending on the religion one believes in, choose to do bad things. And so it's as a result of human choice and human agency that badness enters into the world, not as a result of God's choices. And so God is, morally speaking, off the hook for this. Humans are on the hook for the evils that exist in the world. Now, that's a good response to make, and it, of course, has generated a certain number of counter responses, so let me turn to those. This argument, the first thing is to point out that it only explains some of the bad and or evil things that come into existence in the world. It doesn't explain natural evils. So, a hot summer's night, we're swatting mosquitoes, and we say, why did God create mosquitoes? They are the evil little buggers that they are. Existence of evils is not, of mosquitoes rather, is not a result of human free will. And then more larger scale things like hurricanes that kill lots of people, and all kinds of diseases that kill lots of people and so forth. So there's lots and lots of bad things, and these are perhaps metaphorically evil, that come into existence. Those are not a result of human free will. So why would God create a world with mosquitoes and tornadoes and cancer and all of that sort of stuff? So he's not off the hook for those ones. But more specifically, even if we do focus on the human evils, and obviously a huge amount of evil that does exist as a result of human beings and their actions, if God is the Father, then he's not really off the hook for a lot of those evils as well. And so if we think, for example, you're a parent and you've got a couple of children, say, and yes, your children have free will and you want them to exercise their own free will, and they're going to make good choices and bad choices. But it's not the case that, anytime your child does something bad with his or her free will, the parent is off the hook. I mean, suppose, I don't know, you're a parent, you've got 2 kids, they're out playing in your backyard, you're sitting there watching them, you can see that one of them is, they're getting into an argument, and one of them is losing his temper, and he's gone and picked up a stick, and he's walking over to the other child, and the stick is being raised, and clearly the kid's going to hit the other kid with a stick. And you're the parent, and you just sit there and you just watch, and you don't say anything and you don't do anything. And then sure enough, the one kid hauls off with the big stick and hits the other and breaks the kid's arm to say, well, hey, I created the child, and the child has free will, and it's the child's free will. I'm off the hook. I didn't do that particular action. You say, no, you're the parent. Part of being a good parent is overriding your child's free will at certain points. And so the question then would be, why doesn't God the Father, who's overlooking and involved, step in more often and override particularly the large-scale abuses of free will? And these are the ones that we really would need to think about. So maybe we say, people jaywalk and cheat on their taxes a little bit here and there, and God's going to turn a blind eye. But think about the worst abusers. If God really is on the scene. So there's the serial killer, and he's out stalking his 11th victim. And, the previous 10 times, the guy has stalked a victim, caught her, done horrible things, and killed her, and gotten away with it. Presumably God was aware that this was going on. God could have done something about it. And God is, a good guy, but he lets it happen. What conceivable purpose would there be to God allowing the 11th victim to come into existence, and then the 18th victim, and the 27th victim, and so forth? That seems like the more reasonable excuse is not to say, oh, well, it's all just the serial killer's free will. Well, yes, okay, fine, but if you're going to believe in God, you need to say a little bit more than that. And then particularly the case of the most extreme genocidal killers in human history. Okay, let's make the argument from Adolf Hitler at this case here. Why don't we just say, for example, I don't know, God in his knowledge is watching the night that Mr. and Mrs. Hitler, I think this is 1880s, maybe 1889 or so, they're going to bed. This is the night that little Adolf is going to be conceived, and God is watching, and he says, oh, if that particular sperm meets the egg, then yes, she's going to get pregnant, and little Adolf is going to be born. And then 40 or 45 years later, he's going to grow up to be the leader of the National Socialists and a genocidal maniac. And so what I'm going to do is, I'm just going to interfere at this point, and I'm going to stop that particular sperm. It's going to be another sperm that will impregnate Mrs. Hitler, and yes, she'll get pregnant, and a little boy is going to be born, and they're going to call him Adolf, but he's going to grow up to be just kind of an ordinary human being with the small-scale bad things that normal human beings do. So why not? All right, well, that's the free will response and the standard counter responses to it. Now, another response, though, and this is a follow-up response, so this would be a counter response, is to say, well, maybe the reason why God allows evils to come into existence is that God wants us to learn the difference between good and evil. He wants us to be moral agents. That's part and parcel of our being given free will in the first place. But for us to become moral agents, we have to knowingly choose the good over the evil. And for us to find out what ultimate justice has in store for us, we, in effect, have to be put to the test, and the test isn't going to work unless we are informed about the choices that we are making. So God then allows evils to exist to teach us the difference between good and evil. And absent any evil in the world, we would never learn, and so we never would become moral agents in the full sense. All right, interesting. So the analogy here can be extended to parenting. So as a parent, maybe you would not protect your child from all of the bad things and the evil things that can happen in the world, because you want your children to learn the difference. And so you'll let them do some risky things. You'll let their feelings get hurt. You'll let them get skinned knees and so forth, and suffer broken hearts when they are teenagers, because that's going to build character and prepare them for being full moral agents by the time they are adults. Okay, good. So this then is to say that God is, in addition to giving us free will, a kind of empiricist, and we have to learn the difference by actual experience. But this then leads to the kind of responses that people will make to the moral education response, and that's to say, well, look, suppose God wants us to know the difference between good and evil. Why couldn't he just implant that knowledge in us? Why do we need to experience it? So, for example, we have taste buds that in many cases say if something is too bitter, it's probably not good for us. If it's got a sweet taste, it's got some sugars in it, that's some nutritional value. So just like many other animal species, they can be programmed to know what's good and bad for them. So why can't we have, say, a moral instinct? And of course, some theories of morality will posit, a little angel on one shoulder and a little devil on another shoulder as a way of kind of graphically representing the little voices inside your head that say this is good, this is bad. So why couldn't we just be programmed with the knowledge, and then we can choose to act on that knowledge or not? Why do we have to experientially acquire the knowledge? All right, so there's a possible counter there as well. But the main and most common argument that's made here is to say that if the job of evil in the world is to teach us a lesson about the difference between good and evil, it seems like the quantity of evil that exists is way overkill in order to achieve that purpose. So, for example, suppose we take the big genocides, and we take the Holocaust, and we say, all right, fine, everybody the world over learns about the Holocaust, and they should, as an example of evil, and partly then God's purpose is for us to learn that there really is such a thing as terrible evil, so that when we're young, the lesson is really driven home and we all are redoubled in our commitments not to engage in genocidal behavior, to be more tolerant and understanding and so forth. But the numbers are a bit beyond what seems to be necessary for the vast majority of the population to get the lesson. So, the Holocaust, 11 or 12 million people. Suppose you're a high school kid and you're reading the history textbook, and the history textbook accurately said, and in the Holocaust, the National Socialists killed 8 million Jews and other people and so forth, and that was really evil. Well, I know my reaction would be, wow, 8 million people, that's just horrible. And then a few examples to really drive the point home. I would get it. I would understand the point. I would learn the lesson. So if I can understand the point with only 8 million people being killed, what's the point of the additional 4 million? That's way overkill and completely unrelated to teaching the lesson. And in fact, if it had been 2 million people instead of even 8 million, or, I don't know that I'm outstanding with respect to my cognitive powers to understand things, but, if you would have said 100,000 people were systematically tortured and killed by the Nazis and examples were given, I'm pretty sure I could have gotten the point with 100,000 people. So what's the point of saying, allowing the Holocaust to have been well over 100 times as bad? That seems to be way out of scale. It also brings in the kind of charge that is directed against utilitarian moral principles, and that is to say that this argument does seem to then be ascribing to a kind of utilitarianism, which seems to say that in order for some people to get a good lesson, that is to say for the rest of us to learn a lesson, God is allowing a certain number of people to be tortured and killed and have other bad things happen to them so that we can learn the lesson. But that seems rather unjust, and no moral God is going to allow terrible things to happen to some people in order to do good things for other people. And this argument also seems to run into the problem of the large number of undiscovered evils. If the existence of evil is to teach us a lesson, well, there are lots of serial killers and people who do bad things and they never get caught and nobody ever finds about the horrible thing that they did. And so all of those things don't teach anybody a lesson. Why on earth does God allow those ones to happen? All right, so far then we've got two responses, the free will response and the moral education response, and then a set of responses to those responses as well. Now, a third response to the argument from evil is also quite common. That then is to say that it's the greater good that is achieved as a result of the particular evils. And sometimes this is paired with a slightly agnostic response, that is to say, yes, we human beings, this seems to be pretty evil, but if God has a bigger picture perspective on what's going on, and from his perspective, he can see that the small-scale evils that are occurring, they seem pretty big to us, but really, therefore, the greater good in the bigger picture or the longer term. So have a little faith sometimes is conjoined with that, and trust God on this particular score. Now the response here standardly is to say, look, we're supposed to be trying to explain rationally why we should believe in this particular perfect God. And an agnostic response like this is not sufficient. So if you're going to posit that there is a greater good, you can't just leave it as an empty hypothesis. So the question then is going to be, okay, you think there's a greater good being served by the existence of these evils, and so God allows them. Well, what is that greater good? And you do bear a burden of explanation to come up with a plausible greater good. If it's just a matter of putting some words out there to diffuse a criticism, that's not an adequate response. So you want to say, for example, all right, the little girl, she picked up the pipe bomb, she's now blinded and paralyzed in one hand, and that serves the greater good. Well, what greater good do you have in mind? And then you might say, well, in the town where that occurred, in Indiana, the townspeople came together and they had prayer vigils, and some social cohesion resulted, and maybe there was a scholarship fund that people donated to the little girl, and she's going to be able to go off to university and she otherwise. So all of these things wouldn't have happened absent that particular evil, and that's the greater good that has in mind. Okay, so the point is you have to come up with something like that and believe that that's God's plan. And you have to do it, though, also for the serial killers and the genocidal maniacs and the Adolf Hitlers in the world. You can't just put the words out there. But there still is the standard response to all such greater good responses. It's an unjust sacrifice of some to benefit other people. So, if you want to say, I don't know, what is the greater good for the mother, for example? The mother of the little girl who's experienced the pipe bomb. Is that her greater good? She has to go through the rest of her life having realized that her, beautiful child has now been disfigured, and her life is going to be, in many respects, emptier and a lot more difficult than it otherwise would be. If it's the greater good for the townspeople and for the mother, and the little girl has to suffer in order for that greater good, well, that's a standard charge against such utilitarian types of arguments. Dostoevsky, for example, who was a strongly religious man, totally rejected this sort of response, and he gave in Brothers Karamazov an example where one of his characters asks another, he says, suppose you try these utilitarian greater good theodicies, and you say, look, suppose I gave you the possible scenario where you could, and you would know that this would happen if you just took one baby and you tortured that baby to death, but as a result of that torture, all of the ills and evils of the world would be forever banished and the world would become a perfect place. Would you torture that baby to death and think that you are doing a good thing? And Dostoevsky's answer was to say, no, absolutely not. There's no way that you can reconcile a greater good argument on that score. Now, another kind of response, and I think this one is a little weaker, you don't hear it quite as often, but for the sake of the record, put it out there, it's called the retribution response. And that then is to say, yes, there are all of these evil things that happen, but it's all part of God's plan in the afterlife, and in the afterlife, God's infinite justice materializes. And the evildoers are judged, and they are punished in hell. And those who suffer evil are compensated, and they are rewarded in heaven. And so, perhaps your life is terrible as a result of some evils that were suffered by you. But after you've been in heaven for a century, a millennium, a few billion years, you look back and you say, well, really that wasn't such a big deal. It really was small potatoes in the grand scheme of things, and I feel amply rewarded. And then the same thing with respect to the people who do the really evil things. They get their due. So ultimately, everything is fine in the long run. Now, the standard response to this, and why this is a weak response, is to say, the fact that the evil is made up for or compensated later doesn't change the evil in the first place. So if you have a father, and a father loses his temper and hits a child, for example, the fact that the father might then say, here's an ice cream, or here's $20, I'm sorry, that doesn't change the fact that that was a bad thing and it shouldn't have happened. So the fact that God allows evils to occur and makes up for them later doesn't change the fact that he shouldn't have allowed them to happen in the first place. He is negligent in that particular case. And the same thing would be for a parent who is negligent. If you watch a bad thing happen to your child and you don't do anything about it, making up for it afterwards doesn't change anything, right? If some bully is beating up on your child and you could stop it, the fact that after the fact you didn't stop it, but you went and you punched the bully yourself then, and you buy your kid an ice cream. No, you were still negligent. So that seems like a very weak response. Now, another kind of response, and these get weaker as we go along, I think, is to argue and kind of to abandon the attempt to do natural theology and to justify the existence of a perfect God, is to start appealing to cognitive weaknesses of human beings and to metaphysical positions that seem rather absurd. One position is to argue, and I'll start with the metaphysical one, that in fact the natural theology premise that evil exists is wrong. In fact, there are no evils in the world. In fact, the only thing that perhaps is an evil or a badness is our perception that there are evil things in the world. This is a kind of a hardcore position that says God did create the world. The world is an expression of God, and since God is perfect, the world has to be perfect. So if in our looking at the world we think we're seeing bad things and evil things, well, the problem is with our perception, not the reality of the world. And so what we then have is what strikes me as a rather bizarre perspective on the existence of evil in the world. And again, these kind of responses are then to say, well, if you are fine with saying that the National Socialists weren't evil, that the rape of little children isn't evil, I don't know what to say to you. That doesn't seem like a rational position. That seems like a kind of denialism. And if you want to say that we're just looking at it the wrong way, well, then again, you do bear the burden of explanation. Look at someone who is suffering from Alzheimer's. Tell me, what's the better way to look at this person suffering from Alzheimer's, right? Or we see mass murderer and rapes and so forth. How are we supposed to look at those in a better way? What's just the wrong perspective that we're taking, or what's the thing that we are overlooking? And absent a pretty compelling explanation, these seem to be avoidance of the problem rather than a good faith effort to solve the problem. Now, at this point, there are, I think, three standard moves that people can make. One standard move, and this is the atheist or the non-theist position, is to say, looked at the argument for evil in strong form. We looked at all of the responses to it and the counter responses, and the argument is sound. There just is no way to reconcile the existence of a so-called perfect God with the actual world. It's not to say that the world is a bad place, but the world has a lot of badness and a lot of evil in it, and that's just incompatible with the existence of a so-called perfect God. So what we should do is just not believe in a perfect God. And that then is to say, essentially, the God of the Jews, the Christians, and the Muslims does not exist. Now, a second response, and this is an orthodox response, is to say, in fact, if you do try to be rational and logical, there is no way to answer the theodicy problem. And so what this shows then is that what we should do is not try to be rational and logical and to wrap our puny minds around understanding the ways of God in the world. Instead, we should recognize that if we look at the world rationally, yes, the theodicy problem is unsolvable. And so what we need to do, though, is maintain our belief in a perfect God, but maintain it as an act of faith and just say, reason is inadequate. I'm not going to play that game. I'm going to make a faithful commitment to believe in my perfect God. And so this is a hardcore faith position and an anti-rational position. Now, there is a set of third options that try to split the difference, and there are some positions that are within Islam, within Judaism, and within Christianity that try to reconcile by modifying the conception of God. And they will say, if we believe in an absolutely perfect God, the atheists are right. We would have to come to be atheist and disbelieve it because there is no way to do so. So what we need to do is modify God's perfection in one or more directions to make it logically compatible with the existence of evil in the world. So we could say, for example, that God is all-powerful and God is perfectly benevolent, but his knowledge is limited. And so by creating creatures like us with free will is a real agency, it's a real power. But if it's to be a real agency and a real power, that means God cannot ahead of time know the choices that we are going to make. The future is open-ended in that respect. And so God is perfectly powerful, God is perfectly good, and God is extremely knowledgeable in that he knows everything past and he knows that everything that's going on right now, but he does not know the future choices that human beings are going to make. Now, that then is to limit God's perfection in a way that makes it more compatible with the existence of bad choices. They do come into existence as a result of free will. But this is not acceptable and has been branded a heresy within at least Orthodox Christianity. But there are some movements within Christianity that persistently over the centuries will want to go in this direction. Now, another way is to limit God's power, and this is another very persistent view within Christianity. So it's one of the heresies that crops up in every generation, and it gets stamped down sometimes more forcefully than others, and it's one that comes up actually very popular in a lot of Hollywood movies. And this is the position that says that in fact God is not all powerful, that there is evil in the world, and the reason why evil exists in the world is that there is another force, a dark force, an evil force, Satan, the devil, Lucifer, whoever, and this being also has a certain amount of force, but in the service of malignancy and depravity. And so while God is perfectly good and God is perfectly knowing and very powerful, he cannot impose his will entirely on the world. And instead, the way the world works is that it's a kind of a titanic drama between the forces of good and the forces of evil. Sometimes the forces of good win, but sometimes they lose. And sometimes the forces of evil win, and the history of the world goes on. So the God that we should believe in is a good, all-knowing God, but one who is fighting as best he can against the forces of evil, but sometimes he can't stop them from having their way. All right, so what we then have is a number of positions that will deny one of the dimensions of God's perfection. And while we're at it, we could say we can also, of course, deny God's perfection morally. We can say that God, sometimes he loses his temper. Metaphorically, he gets up on the wrong side of the bed, or we test his patience beyond its bounds, and so he's not infinitely patient, and sometimes he's not infinitely forgiving, and so he is a good father, and for the most part he's good, but once in a while he loses it, and that's why a certain amount of evil occurs in the world as well. Okay, so what we then have is really three options that the theodicy argument leaves us with. One is the hard atheist position to say, look, we just have to abandon any belief in a perfect God, go with the world as it is. Yes, it's a world that has badness in it, it has goodness in it, and that's just a brute fact, particularly the natural badness, and it's really going to be up to us as human agents to take charge of our own control over our actions, and if the world is going to become better, it's up to us to make it better by controlling ourselves and not waiting for a perfect being to make the world perfect for us. Those who don't want to do that, who want to believe in a perfect being, and who are forced by the argument from evil to resort to an agnostic and faith-oriented position to do so, and those who are still arguing for a moderate heretical position that will limit God's powers in order to maintain the belief, but maintain the belief in a way that makes it logically compatible with the existence of evil.